In every movement, there have been activists who have fought tirelessly for racial justice.
Don't shoot! Don't shoot!
In this series, we dive into the lives of activists who stood on the front lines of two pivotal eras of the Black liberation movement, the Civil Rights Movement.
The church is always supposed to be the safe sanctuary if you're sitting in there. But we were amazed while we were in there.
And the uprisings following the tragic death of Mike Brown.
We've seen officers respond in such a heavy way that dogs out, tanks, tear gas, M16s, like this was Iraq.
For these activists, what was there to gain? Or, better yet, what was there to lose in their fight for freedom? On this episode, the modern Black arts movement. Welcome to I Bear Witness, Freedom Fighters on the Front Line. I'm your host, Tiffany Lee, and today we have Dail Chambers. Dail Chambers embodies sustainable living through visual and conceptual art making. She is a visual artist, creative consultant, and grower. Her visual art practice is a multimedia exploration in genealogy, women's narratives, and social environmental art. She has received numerous awards and fellowships throughout the United States. As a homeschooling, teaching artist mother, she has traveled internationally, creating curriculum lessons plans to enhance and motivate intergenerational learning environments. So welcome to the show, Ms. Dail Chambers.
Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you for being here. Since we are on Freedom Fighters on the Front Line, I would like to ask you the question, how would you define a freedom fighter?
A person that's a freedom fighter, I would imagine, is a person who realizes the constraints in their own daily lives and see that there's some kind of societal implication outside of their own desires or experiences that put them there. And then the freedom fighter would have decided, yes, this is something that I want to invest in changing. I want to see liberation for myself, my loved ones, my family, and come up with some steps to make that happen.
So what would you say were constraints that you have faced in your life?
Well, I am a Black woman, and I grew up as a young Black girl in America. And so I've been censored. I've been, assimilated to a degree based on my skin tone. I have been stereotyped, and I have been pushed into a direction where upward mobility was more important than my humanity. I've directly had to navigate racist constructs throughout the entirety of my life. And I'm so thankful because I come from a family of Southerners who had political analysis to explain to me what was happening as it was happening. So I also am a teen mother, gone grown. I have an adult child and a child that's still in her youth now. And growing up as a teen mother added additional constraints that were societal. And even the chance that I would have the audacity to want to become a professional fine artist when that is not the norm for most Black single teen mothers was a challenge that I had to navigate throughout my career and even now.
I think that's interesting that you say that about the assimilation and how upward mobility essentially may deny you humanity. I think it's interesting because in some ways, Think Black was founded by me last year. We talked briefly about that a second ago. essentially to try to show us in our full vision of who we are. I know that's not fully possible, right? But to start thinking about ourselves in a different way, right? Because some of the things that we are told about who we are in this American society can really affect how we feel about ourselves as a people. So,
Yes.
yeah.
I mean, for me, I've had a wonderful, beautiful life in many regards where there's been times when people simply couldn't believe the stories that I have of wonder and adventure because of my identity. And also it includes having to let loved ones and professionals know that the fine arts was a pathway that I wanted to take. There's uncertainty there in that industry.
Right.
And for what it's worth, my ancestors and elders were not prepared for me to take that large leap, nor were the institutions that I leaped into.
Okay. I think it's interesting too that you say that, because oftentimes I feel like as Black people that we don't necessarily have the means to pursue a dream, right? So when you're saying you want to go into fine arts and, you know, you're a single Black mother trying to go into this field that most of your family and everything really didn't fully understand, what were some of the obstacles that you had to overcome within your family and, like you said, within these institutions?
Well, I had to raise the awareness that the talent that had been passed down to me through generations was a viable opportunity for economic growth.
Okay.
So that meant that I had to learn sustainable economic models, because I do not come from a rich family or even what I would say an upper middle class family. So inviting in ideas and also uplifting and elevating the ideas of cooperative economics that might be there in my small family setting, but is not as impactful when looked at from a capitalist standpoint. Also, you know, they were hoping I became an attorney, you know,
Right.
So let's be practical. I need a
Right.
check. I need a paycheck. Who's going to pay for this college, and how are you going to do it? How are you, little girl, going to do this with this baby on your hip?
Right.
Are all the things that I had to advocate for myself for. I do have people who in my family or who are relatives that showed interest in my art or saw a likeness in my craft to things that they have taught me. So I don't want to disrespect my family line, but in terms of how to make an art career out of the things that are in our homes, that was something foreign at that time for my family. And once I got into college, many other Black families, because there was not that many of us. I may have been the only Black woman in my graduating class at Memphis College of Art that actually had a bachelor's of fine arts that wasn't focused in design or graphic design or illustration.
Right. Well, as you say that, it is interesting because I think about my experience with my son, and he loves art, and I was trying to push him into graphic design. I'm like, okay, and this is how you do art and make money. Yeah. So I see exactly what you're saying. And when you look at you now, you scream art. Like, I mean, I see an artist sitting in front of me, right? But what does it for young Black little girls that might watch this show? What does that trajectory look like? How did you move through from where you came from to this artist that you are today?
Well, I was the first Black intern at the Regional Arts Commission of St. Louis before they came up with the Katherine Dunham Fellowship that was inspired by Sarah and Jack Burke, who I'm not sure if Sarah is a commissioner now, but was a commissioner at that time over 20 years ago. And so I had to do a lot of self-sacrificing that actually is outdated for us now in a more liberal kind of culture. So I had an unpaid internship where I had to still work, go to college, and then do this basic professional development that showed up as in-kind time of donated time. How did I survive those things that were difficult? That's what you're really asking me. I've kept a journal throughout my life. I have my journals from when I was 10 years old. So if there's moments of concern in a society that's larger than my day-to-day life, or there are something that's pressing in my day-to-day life, like especially as a young mother, having to pay rent, or get art supplies, things that were required standards to be considered an artist or art student, I was able to use my journals as a way to build up my own visual language and my own understanding. So my own visual language looked like using found art objects. Even when I started in community college. So I remember one assignment that still is a part of my practice to today, where I was a photography student at the time. I have a degree in photography, ceramics, and art history. But I knew that my resources were low. But also I had an understanding that I'm very inspired by Alex Haley, She's telling of my generation, but all the things that were happening in the 80s and the late 70s with Black cinema and Black film, I was able to look at those TV shows and say, that's just like my family, my great aunts and my grandfather and my great grandmother and the stories I've heard. And find the materials that represent that. And to look outside of the standards of what Eurocentric art making may be, to kind of dig down deeper. Now, when I got there, I found out that there was a genre for that most of the times that folks call that folk art. And even with my multiple degrees, sometimes I'm still considered a folk artist. But the accomplishment is getting the idea out into the world, with or without the degree, or with or without the backing. And because there's materials around us everywhere, there's so many ways that we can get that done. But the only way we can truly use any material for the purposes of our imagination is if we know who we are and are willing to say something about that and willing to have a voice. Once we begin to silence our voice, that's when we lose our creative intuition.
Wow, that is very interesting. Very well said.
Thank you.
I'm thinking about your work and in relation to the Black arts movement of the 60s, which was kind of like the art part of the movement, right? So pursuing the civil rights through art. Do you consider your work an extension of that?
My extension of my art practice begins with ancient civilization and works its way up to the current times. And I'm greatly influenced by the Black arts movement, especially those folks that were up in Chicago. I want to say that it was a pleasure as a young Black single mother to be in such close proximity to people like Ntozake, let's say even Amiri Baraka.
Oh, you met
my
Amiri
daughter.
Baraka.
My oldest daughter, I would have to tote her around with me to all the lectures, all the art events, and what I was instilling in her, even through the generations, was a conversation about Blackness and being marginalized or undervalued and how we express that. So yes, I've met Amiri Baraka, I've met Haki Madhubuti, I've met Ntozake in my lifetime. Shirley LaFleur was so impactful for me. And those folks leading the way gave me a foundation to continue to create. And to also allow me the opportunity to see possibilities outside of the academic standards or what was socially popular.
And let's talk about that. So can you tell our listeners who is Amiri Baraka?
Well, Amiri Baraka was born Leroy Jones, and he is a multifaceted writer. He does plays, he does poetry, he's an advocate and activist. That was a leading figure in the Black arts movement.
Right. Yes, exactly.
4 Revolutionary Plays was one of my favorite books.
Oh, I have not read that though. Okay. I was introduced to some of the work by Amiri Baraka when I was studying English literature, and it was an essay that he wrote basically in response to Charles Roel, I think his name is. I can't remember how to pronounce his last name, but what Charles Roel was saying in his book was, he was talking about poets, of course, but he was talking about post discrimination or post-racism era, right? So you can imagine that essay that Amiri Baraka wrote in response to him saying that these poets came out in the post-racism era. He of course was like, there is no post-racism era,
Yes.
So that was before the Ferguson uprisings, but after Obama had been elected. So a lot of people were saying, this is post-racial America once Obama had been elected and everything. So you were involved with the Ferguson uprisings, correct?
Before we jump to the Ferguson uprising, before Occupy, I had a studio practice in St. Louis Place, around the corner from Karen House. And I remember when I introduced my daughter to Amiri Baraka, somehow there was a conversation that came up with one of my mentors at the time. And I talked about how he reminded me of a snow owl. Okay.
How so?
I think it was his demeanor and his general look at that age in his life, and something about the perch of it all,
Okay.
And I don't remember exactly why I chose snow owl in particular. It could have been a barn owl or whatever the case may be. But if you check the news, if you go back into the archives, you'll find that the day that Amiri Baraka passed, that there was an article, I want to say maybe it was Chicago Tribune or Environmental magazine, but that same mentor came back and found the article when he died, because there was a great migration of snow owl.
Really?
This is traceable. This is traceable. Wow. And it was just so impactful to me how it is we could take an analogy of a person's type and how it relates to all of nature. And what are the odds that great migration of snow owl will also happen at the point of his passing. Right. And how poetic that was, and how there's a co-poem there. And so I ended up painting a picture of a snow owl migration in black and white, and I titled it Amiri Baraka Came to Me as a Snow Owl.
Oh, wow. Okay. Is that available anywhere where people might be able to see it?
Well, if you look in my social media archives, you'll see it under Dail Chambers. But I don't think it's on my website anymore.
Okay. Oh, wow. So I know you said that he and others were a large influence in your work. Before you went to Chicago, were you really a part of the like Black liberation and everything like that?
Well,
or-
I believe that with a conscious mind and a Black-skinned body, that everyone is a part of the Black liberation movement.
Okay.
And so, although I have family that lives in Chicago, I have centered, my mother is a Marine, my father is a Marine, and my mother's side of the family is strongly Southern, coming from Mississippi, Polk County, Natchez, Clarksdale, and Sunflower. Sunflower is also where Fannie Lou Hamer did a lot of her organizing work. And as I learned the stories of my family and what my family instilled in me, as we talked about in this earlier in the interview, the family stories began to correlate. I see that it is that I was birthed out of a movement that was already moving.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and
that's powerful.
It is, and most of us are, especially being in St. Louis and us having these migration stories from the South, and how our elders and ancestors navigated those stories really actually gives us a clear map and path to liberation.
How so?
Well, it is. One thing that I love about Southern culture is the barter and trade system, which is an alternative economy that can and should compete with direct capitalism. If Miss Josie right here and Miss Suzanne right here, one has butter and one has apples, and I'm in the middle, maybe I want to trade with them my collard greens or my mustards to make apple butter.
Right.
And maybe all of us are going to market in common, in unity, and not in competition, because it's a clear economic support to all of us for us to sell. An advantage for all of us to sell our wares, because we are going to put it back into our localized economic system. Other ways is that when we look at past archives of Greenville, Mississippi, and how they had public discussion about segregation and integrating the schools. Now, one thing that I've noticed is that in these archives, many Black students loved being amongst their people. And that sense of security and comfort was not found in integration, because we were moved into hostile and volatile environments where adults were being hostile and violent to children. People who did not attend the school or may not have even lived in that county were being hostile and violent to children. I see that most of the Black families in those cases necessarily were not advocates for integration, but were advocates for having the same resources allocated to the Black schools. And I think that's a clear identifier that we have what we need to survive. We need to be able to trust each other and have the space and the capacity and the resources to build something that's as unique as our story for our children's education and for how we operate in society.
It's interesting that you say that, because I think about that sometimes, like Little Rock 9, and you see them going into the school, and it's like, who wants to go there? We see that as a seminal moment in the civil rights movement, but can it be perceived very differently? And, what you're talking about is that different perception of what that was. And a lot of times you talk to older African Americans, and they will talk about being taught Latin in the schools, and that they were taught by people who were invested in their education and wanted to see them succeed.
And essentially love them.
Yeah, exactly. Versus where we are now. And I often wonder, if integration was actually helpful to our community or more harmful, ultimately, because prior to integration, you could live next to a doctor or a lawyer, or, everybody in the community knew one another. And in some ways, even though you still had those socioeconomic barriers, you still had relationships with those people in the community that were doing great things. I came from East St. Louis, so everybody was black. The mayor was black, and you might have a judge that lived up the street, and that person is black. And so you see those things, and now a lot of black communities, because of integration, those people have left. They've left the core of the African American community. Now you see people starting to come back, which is a good thing. But so I guess you've already kind of explained, but how would you say that integration affected us as a black people?
Well, I think that this is an interesting concept to explore, and that there's evidence in most urbanized environments of how integration did not necessarily help the black community, maybe black individuals and individual families, but not the community as a whole. But what is most interesting with what the example I gave you for me is that looking at the historical accounts that have been recorded in Greenville of these meetings, that the black folks didn't actually get what they were advocating for, which is the same resources.
Right.
And for me, that is where we really need to explore, because we oftentimes, just like with me being an artist, we get hit with, well, we can't do that, or they ain't gonna want you there, right? But how can we change these narratives to, oh, we have everything we need, so there's no desire to leave our neighborhoods, our communities, our schools, our families?
Yes. Okay. So now, let's move to Ferguson.
Yes.
Let's take it. Okay. So, how exactly was your work fulfilled in Ferguson?
Leading up to Ferguson, my daughter went to Youth Positive, also called Maya, an organization for Black struggle.
Okay.
I had a loose membership with that organization. I was active during Occupy because I founded something called Yayo Arts Collective. Yayo Arts Collective is dedicated to the creative empowerment of women and families, but we're the first known Black women's cooperative in the state of Missouri, as told to me through my research and through Shirley LaFleur. So talking about alternative systems, alternative economies, and Black economic empowerment, I was in the midst of that work when the Mike Brown shooting occurred, and the Ferguson uprising came thereafter.
Right.
My personal role in that is that I offered healing sessions and healing circles for any of the frontline protestors of that time to come. And a session for Reiki can cost anywhere from $60 to $125. And I opened my schedule and my space up on Wednesdays for free for any of the frontline protesters. Many meetings, organizing meetings, were done at the gallery of Yayo Arts Collective to organize their next actions and things during that time. And I felt that was being a second liner to a degree was my best way to support the movement.
And and it's interesting because I was telling you that I did some interviews, and you were recommended as a frontliner. Right. And the reason why I think is because healing is so important in this work, right? So can you talk to us a little bit about the health issues and issues that mental health, physical health issues that may come from suffering racism or being on the front line?
Well, it was very disheartening for me to hear some of the people that I truly love in the movement, in the work, tell me that they wanted to keep their anger in the midst of protest. Because I know that, I've been trained through Jobs with Justice, Organizers Training, Ella Baker Institute, People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New Orleans. So I am a trained organizer, but I'm a human, I'm a mother. And I want to grow old with my community.
Right.
And so keeping the anger can show up in our personal lives as not only a mental health issue, but heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune disorder, high blood pressure, low blood pressure even. And those things we might put to the side because we think that it's not going to affect us later. But it has a direct correlation to when we caregive for our elders now. A lot of us that have been enlightened through veganism, vegetarianism, and what we know to be wellness might fuss at our elders because they have chosen to continue to eat chitlins or ham hocks and the things. But I'm also looking at the environmental stressors that our elders and ourselves and even my daughter has had to go through, because racism plays a part in every aspect of our built environment. Racism determines what zip code. It determines how a person treats you in that zip code. It gives you poor air quality. I've advocated for an issue with air pollution and the illegal demolitions that happen in our communities that would not happen in Clayton or Frontenac, where there's no water being used when the buildings are being demolished. Sometimes those things seem to only happen in the lowest of economic status, and those folks mostly have beautiful black skin. So those are the things that we forget or may not know. Oh, my child has asthma. Your child may not have been born with asthma. It may be the poor built environment that has been tearing away at generations of your family line. And this is not an intergenerational health issue, but a collective societal issue about how we treat Black people. And for me as a doula, Black mothers, when we look at the mortality rate and the stressors, the environmental stressors that happen that can lead to incomplete pregnancy as well as issues during birth. A lot of times they directly correlate to racism, sexism, and classism.
Yeah, what you're speaking to as well as it has become a huge issue that people are talking about as far as first the environmental racism that occurs, right? So the environmental justice that everybody is kind of looking at right now because, of course, being from East St. Louis, we know all of the chemicals and everything that came into the city. And as you're saying, we have higher rates of asthma because of the environment that we're being put in and lower regulations in our area when we're talking about whether it's pollution or, like you said, demolition and so forth. So racism squeezes the life out of us. And the way it's done is through capitalism. So when we have to go to our grocery stores and pick what foods we eat, when we have to decide which bills are most important, when we have to decide how we're going to get to and fro, all those things affect our health. And this is before we get to mental health, before we talk about PTSD or depression or even right now seasonal depression because we're in the colder time of the year in the Missouri. So I believe that racism will help kill us, even if it's not a violent death. It is a passively violent death. Wow. Oh, yeah, that's powerful to even think about or consider. It seems like your work, just overall, from your experiences in your family history, your artwork, and your work in the Black community, that it just led you into this health field as well.
Literally. Yeah. Literally. Because when I look at the people that I care about in my household, in my neighborhood, on my block, or the people I'm communing with, my chosen and beloved family and community, we all have shared stories. And so at a certain point, we have to decide, how am I going to add to a solution here? And so my art and healing practices have been in the vein of attempting to come up with a solution. And what solutions have you implemented thus far? Well, one thing is that during the Ferguson uprising, the day that Mike Brown was shot, I was living on the South Side. Now, my family history is not of the South Side. I was there being an artist, you know, and it was
No, just, I don't want to cut you off, but south side of St. Louis.
the
right?
South Side of St. Louis,
Okay.
yes.
Go ahead.
And so, of St. Louis City, to be specific. And so there's a disconnection there. My grandmother, and at the time, my great aunt, who I caregived for, is a 63135 area code. So I was driving about 20 minutes further to even caregive, okay? How does that...
63135 is what for our listeners?
That is Ferguson, Calverton Park, anything by McClure North High School, all the way to, a part of Ferguson is 63135, and I believe the other part might be 63136.
Okay.
Berkeley, Missouri,
I lived in
Kinlock,
Berkeley for a short time. But I think it's important that we know, because for people here in this area, we know South St. Louis City versus Ferguson, but people in the United States is like, oh, well, is Ferguson St. Louis? Is Ferguson and St. Louis the same
Well, South
thing?
City has a very much higher white American population than Black American. And I have my great grandmother on my mother's side, my mother and my grandmother, who all came from 63106 and 63107, which is North St. Louis.
Right. Exactly.
So one of the main things that Ferguson taught me is to stay committed to my people. And so I left South City and moved back into North City and also became more closer in vicinity to the people I caregived for. It kind of stripped away the illusion that I was living in by being in South City and being engrossed in the arts, that I didn't have stronger work to do. So when Ferguson came up, just looking even at the population in which I was serving or the artwork in the places I was showing my artwork, was not necessarily conducive to what we're talking about here on this podcast. There was a shooting the same day at California and Potomac as the Ferguson uprising, the day that Mike Brown was shot, and during the time frame that he was still laid on the ground waiting for the processes of Ferguson Police Department.
An investigation.
Yeah. And I say the processes because I understand that if a person that is a police officer makes a shot that kills someone, that they are also not allowed to touch that body. And there's all these other protocols that are in place that it comes up in the reports. But my localized issue at that moment, when I got the call from Montega Simmons, the text message from Montega Simmons, my street was blocked off because there was a different shootout. So the violence was double or triple fold for me that day.
Okay.
And so I had to really sit with that and determine what was my best gift to give. And that's how I determined that the healing had to be what my work was during that time.
Yeah, and I think you talked about the healing, but also you talked about you're a grower too, right? So can you give us a little bit about that as far as how your work in growing is contributing to healing the community?
Well, we talk, St. Louis gets a lot of national press about being a food desert.
Right.
Okay. And St. Louis as a city gets a lot of bad press talking about our food apartheid situation that is intrinsically combined with the Del Mar divide.
Right.
Okay. I have been growing food my entire life. I helped my great aunt that has now passed since the Ferguson uprising in her garden in our backyard growing up. I traveled with my mother as she was an active duty single parent Marine. And I grew plants and things even as a child on my own, independently of the elders in my family. And that translated into my life practice of sustainability and alternative economic systems as I grew older. And I use that term alternative economic systems because that's what's Googleable now. Okay. But most Black folks had gardens in their backyard. Most Black folks have grown tomatoes, some kind of greens, knew how to cook pokeweed, okay? Previous to the generation that I am of, and through the generation that I am of. And so growing food is survival for me. I do not want to depend, just like I do not want to depend on a racist institution or system educating my child. I also don't want that same system to be the sole person that provides my sustenance and nutrition. Okay. So although I'm not completely off the grid in this urban environment, it's important to me to do as much mitigation as possible through healthy foods. So after Ferguson and during Ferguson, I was a farmer, but for my family and friends. Okay. After Ferguson and after moving back to the 63107 area code that my great auntie, my mom, my great grandma, and my grandmother lived in, I was invited into that. I was invited back into the neighborhood by other activists from Ferguson who had started a cooperative housing situation. I did not live in the cooperative house. I knocked on the door to a neighbor across the street and asked to purchase his building at the time that was on Section 8. I'm being very specific about how the things got done so that if anybody hears your show and wants to know how to navigate some of the things I'm talking about, that they have at least a story to create their own path off of. And so through Ferguson, there's a house of activists that started a cooperative house for the purposes of activism. Some of those folks were my close friend at the time and still remain my close friend. And from there, I decided to do a survey of the nutritional awareness of my neighbors. And I door knocked about it, which usually folks are used to door knockers. Either it's for the church or for your elected official.
Right, political, right, politicians.
This is very political. Our nutritional awareness is very political. Okay. And I have no intention of ever running for any kind of office or elected role, but I see a correlation there. And I wanted to know my family's moved out of North City. I'm the only family member left in North City, and I came back to North City. And so I wanted to know, how was my neighbors surviving through all these times? We have some folks a block over from me that's been in their home for 50 years. I have in one of my other farm sites a neighbor who has lived, they're from Menor, Mississippi, actually, Menor City, but they've been living on their block for 60 years. I'm a new person. How have you been surviving all this time through everything I've witnessed, everything I've read about, everything that we're now navigating together? And so I started asking them a series of questions. What's their favorite food? What do they do at home when they got a cold and can't get to the doctor? Things of that nature. And I began to grow it publicly. And I began to be able to, through donation support, as well as my own agricultural practice, also be able to supplement other people's gardens by giving them the starts for their garden based off of the information that I collected from door knocking.
Oh, wow. That is amazing. I'm going to tell you, I can't grow anything. Like, I can't grow. My mother was great, and she had all type of flowers. She didn't really do a lot of gardening, but I remember as a kid, we used to go and actually, it's too late to charge me for this. So we used to go and steal these grapes. People used to grow grapes in their yard. And I remember eating unripe grapes. My grandfather used to have, an apple tree in his yard, and as we grew older, he ended up cutting it down. But you're right, we brought those agricultural ideas here with us north, and somehow we have lost it. But I do love this resurgence of like a reclamation of our history and who we are.
Yes. And I grow everything you mentioned because those things came up, just like how I said earlier, that when we get us all together in the room, we're going to have the same stories, not only the same struggles sometimes, but those points of resistance and those points of resilience shine through. And so for me to hear you share that, it's very affirming to my practice. But I think that is what is going to help us get to a more liberated reality, is by, like you said, reclaiming some of the things that we've lost through urbanization.
Earlier we were talking, and you said you were working with Dr. Redmond, Treasure Redmond, and I of course know Treasure, and I'm really good friends with her father, Eugene B. Redmond. He brought to town David Nelson, who was a member of the Last Poets, part of the Black Arts Movement, and I purchased one of his books. And it's called Counting Up to Infinity. And one line, I wrote several things and notes and everything like that, but one line really struck me. And what he said was, it was his journal. This was a journal that he just released. And he said, I was writing when I was at the bus stop sometime, I was writing, so it was kind of like a stream of consciousness writing. So one of the things that he said on there was, we didn't know that when we were fighting for Black liberation, that we were also on the road to enlightenment. And it just stuck with me, and I kept rolling it around in my head, and I was thinking about it. And I started thinking about the movement. It's like, during the movement, you had people that were moving towards acupuncture, natural healing, veganism and everything. And I was like, that's an interesting concept. Do you agree with that idea?
I wholeheartedly agree. In the road to enlightenment, we don't know where it's going to lead us. And so there's the great mystery that we get to pull from, where it is we have to allow ourselves to open up and be okay with whatever the supposed struggle may be, but we know that there's something more.
Oh, wow. Well, I thank you for coming in today, Dail, taking time out of your busy schedule, doing all of the great things that you're doing. If people want to connect with you, can you give them you said find you on?
The best thing is to go to my website. It's kind of robust, but you can find it at Dail, DAIL, Chambers.life.
Okay, life. That's important. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was really great.
Thank you.